In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to build an awesome $1,000 gaming PC build for 2023. I'll be running you through all the parts that make this build possible and showing you how to put it together as we go and looking at performance later. This thing is a titan for 1080 and a bit of 1440p gaming in all the latest AAA titles. Let's do this.
Just looking for something I can hold on to.
The Cooler Master GM27 FQS comes equipped with a 27-inch Quad HD panel, 165Hz refresh rate, and a customizable ARGB stand. With a super fast IPS panel, you aren't sacrificing image quality for response time, while support for FreeSync Premium and NVIDIA G-Sync make it a great all-rounder. Learn more about this awesome panel at the first link in the description below. And a big thanks to Cooler Master for making this video possible. I'm going to start things off by installing as many components into the motherboard as possible. So of course the first of those has to be the CPU. Now for the processor you've got a couple of options. If you're on the budget end of the spectrum, the i3-12100F will work a-okay, or alternatively you can spend a little bit more money and pick up the i5-12400F. With the i5 you get a couple of extra cores and some slightly faster clock speeds, but in our testing of this build both will work just fine. Intel's 12th and 13th gen lineup of processors have been an awesome shout. The 12th gen particularly gives you similar performance to 13th gen at a lower price, making a more accessible build like this one possible. What's more, you also get support for the cheaper B660 motherboards that also give you support for both 12th gen and, with a BIOS update, 13th gen processors. For this build, there were a few key criteria I wanted to ensure were met with the motherboard I selected. The first of those was the inclusion of Wi-Fi, something that this board's got. You get some antennas in the box, a super speedy signal strength. USB-C was also on the list, USB 3.1 Gen 2, basically super fast USB, and also plenty of PCIe lanes, and that's something that GIGABYTE, well, have really taken to the max on a board like this one. Of course, you got room for your PCIe Gen 4 graphics cards, set any of the latest GPUs, M.2 SSDs, and 4 DDR4 memory slots. That's important. So with Intel 12th and 13th gen, you can use either DDR4 or DDR5, but your motherboard will only support one, so pick carefully, and on a budget, DDR4 will save you some money. Now then, installing a processor is something that, for a first-time builder, can be quite daunting, and to be honest with you, rightly so. You should be careful at this stage of the build. This is where it can go wrong very early on. I was very dramatic. It's totally fine, and actually quite easy once you know what you're doing, but always watch a tutorial like this one before doing so. Now then, this is your CPU socket. This is where the CPU is going to be installed, and I want to point out there's a little black triangle on the bottom corner of the socket cover. Keep that in mind for a moment. Then remove the arm and lift the arm up, which will then release the socket. Underneath the socket, you'll find a load of really delicate pins. These are what people get scared about breaking, and rightly so, because if you break them, game over. Anyway, take the processor, find the golden triangle on this, and line it up with the plastic triangle on the socket cover. Drop the CPU in gently, make sure those triangles are aligned, as that will make sure everything fits a-okay. Pop the cover down with the black plastic still on, and use this little kind of handle to push the socket cover down. The black plastic will pop off, but keep hold of this in case you ever want to sell or send your motherboard back before adding back in the retention arm. You will need to apply a bit of pressure, but you should never force it, as that will likely cause the pins on the CPU to bend. For this build, I'm also going to go ahead and use the included cooler that comes with the processor. These are a great shout for those looking to keep the processor cool enough, but perhaps forgo the ability to overclock or to have a system that's maybe whisper silent. We can't overclock on this board or with this CPU anyway, so no problems there. Add in some thermal paste and then click it down corner by corner. It really is as simple as that. The next stage of the motherboard assembly is to pop in the memory, and I've picked up this GIEL ORION kit of RGB DDR4. If you're not super clued up about PC hardware and just want a great set of RAM for this build, this is the choice for you. But I'll let the rest of you into a secret. Basically any DDR4 3200 MHz kit or above will work fine. RGB and 2 DIMMs is always preferable, giving us dual channel performance and that aesthetic edge, but it's difficult to go too wrong with the memory. I'm going to be installing it into the grey DIMM slots, which we can pull back nice and easily like so. The black ones will remain spare for future use. use. Line up the RAM, slide it in, a bit of pressure to each side, and it will click in nice and easily. Now, there is an argument to be said for picking up some cheaper memory and using the money, I don't know, for a cooler or GPU upgrade, but an RGB kit like this, in reality, is only going to set you back another $20. Something that's not going to get us a particularly fancy cooler anyway. There is one more thing to pop onto the motherboard before looking at the case, the GPU and the power supply a bit later, and that is the SSD. Now, storage-wise, anything Gen 3 NVMe is a good shout, but this XPG SPECTRIX S20G is my flavour of the day. It's an M.2 that I've used a few times before and even has a little hint of RGB for those who want aesthetically just something that little bit different. For this stage of the build, you will need to, however, retire, just for the moment, it will come back later, your standard Phillips head screwdriver. Very sad day. Poor Phillips head gone, no more. And instead, source yourself a much smaller one. That doesn't necessarily mean buying a full kit like this one, but I will link some great kits below that give you a range of different screw heads and can be pretty useful for building a PC. It's always nice to have those extra tools, even if you don't necessarily need all of them. Remove the little M.2 screw that's locked in here, and a magnetic screwdriver is going to really help, as these things are very easy to drop. And if you do drop them, at least with a magnetic screwdriver, you can fish them out nice and easily. The drive is then going to slide into place on the M.2 slot. You don't want to put it in straight at a flat angle. You want to put it in kind of upright, feed it into the slot, and then drop it down. Once you've done that, you'll then see that it doesn't quite secure, which is where the screw comes in. Pop the screw back into place, and that will fasten the drive down firmly to stop it going anywhere. Lovely stuff. So the case choice then is the next thing to touch upon as I move the motherboard assembly into this Deepcool chassis. Now this is Deepcool's CK560. Picking out a case for a system like this is quite difficult. You want to pick something that's ATX and supports regular standard ATX boards like this one. You also want to ensure that it's got good GPU clearance, but that it's also not massive. The higher clearance figures are all great and well, but we only need so much for a build like this one. And a humongous case as good as they are, like the Hype Y60 or Corsair's IQ5000T, are just overkill for a build like this. As you can tell from the open box, I've used Deepcool's CK560 on quite a few occasions. It's got mesh at the front, removable panels, and an awesome aesthetic with a beautiful tempered glass side panel. What more could you ask for? Look at that. Isn't it beautiful? It also comes with some RGB fans as well to add an aesthetic edge. Now, what I'm going to do is lay it down flat and go ahead and remove the side panel, particularly the glass one. Slide it off, and I might as well do the same for the rear panel. I know some of you are going to be wincing at how this is balanced on the table, but it'll be all right. Before hastily throwing this into place, there are two things we need to do first. Check, first of all, where the holes are on the motherboard, and then line these up with the holes on the motherboard tray. Those should then contain standoffs that look like this. They're posts, basically, which hold the motherboard up and stop it grounding out. Additionally, boards like this will also include an I/O shield. More pricey boards have one that's integrated, but in this instance, we do need to clip it in. It clips into this rectangle at the back of the chassis. You can see there are 3 holes on the bottom side for our audio ports, with our Ethernet and USB further on up. It clicks in nice and easily, makes a nice satisfying click sound, and with all the standoffs correctly in place, if they're not, use a pair of pliers to move them. The motherboard can slide in. One of the standoffs in this case is raised slightly, which will hold the board in and stop it moving anywhere. Screw it in from the middle outwards. That's going to make sure that the board doesn't pull too far one way or too far the other. If you find that one of the holes doesn't quite line up, loosen all the other screws, and then that way your motherboard will have a bit more wiggle room and a little bit more tolerance at play. That then brings me on to the penultimate part of the build process in this video, the installation of the graphics card. Now this is evidently an ASUS card, but it's the Radeon RX 6650XT. Now wait, I know some people, not everybody, but some people go, James, I'd rather a 3050 or 3060. Why? This comes in cheaper than both the 3060 and the 3060 Ti. In most cases provides better performance than the 60 Ti, but consistently beats out the 3060, and is a great slightly higher end alternative to the cheaper 6600. AMD graphics cards on the lower end are your best option. Move up to the higher end of the spectrum and maybe it's a slightly different, more pro Nvidia story, but don't sleep on a card like the 6650XT for top tier performance. Typically you would install the card with the case laying flat, but I want to make sure you guys can see the next stage of the process nice and clearly. So the first thing you want to do is push back the clip on the top PCI slot, this one here. Then line it up. You're not going to clip it in, but we're just going to see how it sits. And when you do that, you'll notice that a couple of these covers at the back need removing. Typically for an ATX board, you want to take out the second and third covers. The top one, more often than not, stays in. Once you've removed these covers and the screws that go along with them, keep hold of the screws as you'll need those in a moment. Then for real this time, we can slide the graphics card into place, line it up over the slot, click it in, and there you'll see it's pretty secure. Put the screws in and that will stop the wobble from happening, and then it's a simple case of adding power in a moment, where the final stage of the build, the power supply, comes into play. To provide all of this power is the Corsair CX650F. Now, this is an awesome power supply for any system really, but anything that needs around 650 watts of power, this will work well. Obviously, for a higher end build, you'll need a more chunky, more expensive power supply, but with this pulling in about 350 to 400 watts, this has some headroom for future upgrades, and a good 80 plus bronze efficiency rating. What's more, you've also got a fully modular interface on this power supply, meaning that you can plug in just the cables that the system actually needs. It's a question I get all the time from a first time builder. Do I really need all of these cables, and should I have some left over? No and yes. You're definitely not going to need them all, and yes, you definitely should have some left over. The reason that brands like Corsair and others include all of these cables is so that you can cater for all different types of builds, but in this instance, I'm just going to connect up a motherboard power cable, followed by a CPU, GPU, and SATA. We'll pop some images on your screen now of what all these cables look like to make it easier to find them. One end goes to the power supply, the other goes into the components, which we'll cover off after this thing has been screwed in to the rear of the case with 4 hexagonal screws. In terms of cables and wiring then, there's a few things we need to do, and we're going to start in the top left, work our way round. So the first is the CPU power cable, which plugs up to the top left of the motherboard. It's comprised of 8 pins, which can be separated into 2 4-pin pairs. Motherboard is next. This is 20 plus 4 pins and goes to the right hand side. The easiest way to tell this one apart is that it's the largest, by quite some margin. Next up is the GPU power connector. You might find that you've got a pair of 8-pin or 6 plus 2 pin connectors on the cable. We only need one 8-pin for this efficient 6650 XT. SATA power is going to go to the rear for any RGB controllers, fan controllers, and things like that, or any traditional SATA SSDs or hard drives. Finally, you've got your front panel cables. HD audio goes to the bottom left. It has a pin missing and only goes in one way around. USB 3 is the largest front panel connector from the top of the chassis, and your JFP 1s are the fiddly pins which go in the bottom right. Follow the diagram on your screen now, and don't be scared if you get these the wrong way around, as they're very easy to correct later and aren't going to cause any problems. Your power button or your LED button just might end up as the reset, or the reset button might be the power button, vice versa. So if you get them the wrong way around, don't worry, nothing will explode. And with that, this thing is nearly ready to be powered up. The only other thing I want to add is a rear exhaust fan, because it looks empty, sad, and quite lonely without one. Otherwise though, yeah, we can pick this thing up, see how good the system looks, and I'll rejoin you in a minute for benchmarks in all of the latest and most popular AAA titles. Into performance, and I'm glad to announce that this build stacks up really well. All of our testing today was done at 1080p, as I figured that's the resolution most people will be gaming at on a system like this one. At 1080p high in Call of Duty's Warzone 2.0, FSR, Fidelity Super Resolution, set to quality, this build pulled in an impressive 121 frames per second on average. It was a similarly positive story in the other Call of Duty title recently released, Modern Warfare 2 Remastered. 1080p high with FSR once again set to quality, and this build pulled in an impressive 154 FPS on average. 90 and 99 percentile results were pretty good, and AMD's FSR technology working really well here to supercharge that frame rate that bit further. We used MSI Afterburner's Riva Tuner and Nvidia FrameView at the same time to get fair frame rate data for anyone wondering how they can do so at home. In Fortnite at 1080p competitive, frame rates were also very, very good. AMD worked well in Fortnite due to in-game and driver optimizations, with the 270 frames per second average stacking up really nicely indeed. The 90 and 99 percentiles were both above 220 FPS as well, helping to keep those frame rates looking and feeling consistent. Move into Apex Legends next. 1080p high settings here at 170 frames per second was the result achieved. Very, very strong indeed. While games like Overwatch 2 also performed really well. 1080p using the Ultra preset delivered 235 FPS, with the frame rate of course set to unlimited. If you're looking for a 1080p beast to build in 2023 that isn't going to cost the earth, this might just be the system for you. Check out the links to everything mentioned down below. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.